We'll talk with Jonathan Williams, Chief Economist and Executive Vice President of Policy at the American Legislative Exchange Council about it. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and greetings from the land of make-believe here in Washington. We do have some good new rankings out this week in the new Rich States, Poor States report, so I'm excited to talk about that with you all today.
Well, that's what I want to dive into. ALEC has released their 17th edition of Rich States, Poor States, and talk to us about that. And I want to add something to that. How much does economic factors make a big deal, of course, but how much does climate affect these states' growth?
Well, it depends what kind of climate you're talking about. What we're looking at is the business climate, obviously, and the economics climate. But when it comes to, certainly being a Michigander myself as a native, I was just down in South Florida working for some events down there recently, and it's become basically Michigan South. So getting away from the cold weather in the north, there's a lot of allure to going to southern states. But of course, it's a whole lot more than just the temperature climate. The economic climate, as it turns out, is obviously much, much better in many of those southern states. I mean, folks like Paul Krugman, the fake news economist over at the New York Times, would like to say that the only reason that people are moving away from high tax states and going to low tax states is anything other than taxes. So he likes to use the climate in terms of the weather as an excuse. But of course, we all know that nobody leaves California, ladies and gentlemen, for better weather anywhere else. And yet California is hemorrhaging Americans voting with their feet, going to the other 49 states. And of course, it's because of high taxes and their big government agenda.
Mm-hmm. Jonathan, it's great to speak with you again. And as folks know, I do some work with ALEC as a regional policy officer here in the heartland states. Jonathan, I want to talk about the states that are not the big kahunas, right? Of course, we know this. We know the success story of Texas and Florida and some others. But Jonathan, there's plenty of other states run by fiscally conservative folks who want to lower taxes and reduce spending that don't have such great climates, right? Places like South Dakota, places here in the heartland like Kentucky and Tennessee, completely landlocked, no beaches or palm trees in those states either. But those states are in the top half, and I think many of them are in the top third of states that have really bright economic outlooks because of the policies they proceed. Am I correct in saying all that? And secondly, could you describe some of those big policy priorities that have helped those states be in the top half versus the bottom half of the Rich States, Poor States annual metric?
Well, it's such a great point, Tim, and good to chat with you again as always. If we look at, let's say, the top 5 in this year's Rich States, Poor States for Economic Outlook, and many of those states fall into that exact category as you're talking about, that are landlocked states but are making the most of it with better, more fiscally responsible, common sense policies. I mean, I've talked about Utah many times on this show. They are number one and have been for each and every edition of the report going back 17 years. And so their mix of trying to tackle the property tax rising burdens, which they've done effectively through their truth in taxation law, reforming their pension system, making sure that they push back against federal overreach and the so-called free federal funds that we've been promised when it comes to Medicaid and so many other aspects. I mean, Utah has just been ahead of the curve with the flat tax, and you can go on and on. Idaho at number 2, Arizona at number 3, North Carolina at 4, and then Indiana back in the heartland at 5. These are states, in some cases, like North Carolina and Indiana, these were states that were actually in the bottom half of our rankings towards the start of our Rich States, Poor States project years ago, and have catapulted forward because they elected bold, free market conservative leaders that said, we're not going to be satisfied being middle of the pack. And they have been successful now at breaking through and getting all the way to the top 5. And of course, this isn't just an academic, ranking. The proof is in the pudding, as we often say, saying, it's not just our theories. These are when Americans do vote with their feet and go from state to state. Where are they going? And they're going to states like the ones I just talked about. Utah has been the fastest growing state in America in overall population in the last decade. There is something to this connection more than coincidence and more than certainly the meteorological climate.
Speaking with Jonathan Williams, Chief Economist and Executive Vice President of Policy at the American Legislative Exchange Council. You know, Jonathan, one of the things that worries us about people leaving liberal states like California and New York is that they're going to transplant their liberal ideas and beliefs in these their adopted states and change the electorate of those states. Have we seen any evidence of that lately?
Well, you know, it's I'm the policy guy, not really the political guy, but let me just tell you what I've seen out there, being in all 50 states many times over the years. And, you know, when I think you have a couple of different categories of people who move. In fact, there's just a new story in the Wall Street Journal yesterday talking about how millennials, when they're moving and looking for their jobs, they're going to cities and leaving rural areas. That's been the case for, you know, now decades, but they're not going to New York and Chicago and Los Angeles. They're going to lower cost cities with lower taxes and more job opportunities, because that's the number one reason why people go from state to state, according to the Census Bureau, is for economic opportunity reasons. Then you have your business owners that are generally leaving California and New York and Illinois to go find better policy and lower taxes. And they're generally very fiscally conservative as they move. And then there's kind of the couple other categories. And one is the trust fund millionaires and billionaires that continue to stay in the high tax states. It's because they're at a point in life and well off enough that they can afford the fanciest tax accountants and tax lawyers. And guess what, folks? They're not paying taxes anyways. And so they scoff at the idea that taxes matter. And then the final category, I think, are the folks that are employees that working for the companies, let's say like Oracle, who left California and wisely moved to Texas, and others that maybe didn't directly make that decision. It was made for them by the employer. And I think that's the important group of people that all of us need to talk to and really say, hey, why is it that you had better economic opportunity and you have a job in one state or a better paying job in one state, and maybe we're unemployed in another state? And people need to have those dots connected for them from an economic perspective to say, this is why policy matters. It makes your lives better off. And this gets what? Conservative governance matters for everybody, whether their voting pattern is right, left, or center.
Speaking of Jonathan Williams of the American Legislative Exchange Council, about the 17th annual publication of Rich States, Poor States. This thing is so big, it even has its own website, Jonathan. As you know, folks, you can go to richstatespoorstates.org. There's a really cool interactive map where you can almost immediately see, just by putting your cursor on the state of your choice, where your state is regarding past performance and future outlook. Jonathan, I noticed that the Show Me State, Missouri, has slipped a little bit in previous years. Unfortunately, we're now in 29th place overall, which puts us in the bottom half. I remember a few years ago, we were in the top half of states. And if you look at the states around us, Jonathan, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Kansas, you take those four, they've all leapfrog ahead of Missouri. I know that every single one of those states I mentioned is cutting personal income taxes. They are right to work states, and they provide educational freedom, more educational freedom for parents and kids than Missouri. Are those three of the biggest drivers of performance and outlook, Jonathan, according to this scale? Are those important?
Absolutely. Yeah. And then the others to worry about, too, in the region, as you know well, Tim, is that while Iowa and Nebraska are still rated worse than Missouri right now, they both made substantial investments in future tax cuts that will be phasing in the coming years, and school choice. And so I fully expect that if Missouri doesn't take bold action soon, you're going to be surpassed by those two neighbors as well. And so, yeah, Arkansas is number 15 now, moving up tremendously over the years. And I think Sarah Huckabee Sanders has a goal in her term as governor to eliminate the income tax by the time she's done as governor of Arkansas. And so you have a very competitive neighborhood outside of our economic development partners in Illinois. They're always spewing off jobs and individuals looking to leave the land of Lincoln and go to the other states. That is going to be an increasingly competitive region. And, you know, Missouri's rank is, some people would say, oh, it's middle of the pack. That's not too much to worry about. You know, when you go to richstatespoorstates.org and you track back the 17-year history, there were years when Missouri was in the top 10 for economic outlook in terms of best economic outlook in America. So there's been a big deterioration, not because Missouri's done a lot of really horrible things, but because in this very competitive environment out there, 26 states have substantially cut taxes in the last 3 state legislative sessions. So you can absolutely fall by standing still. in the rankings. And that's just the competitive dynamic that we face across these 50 laboratories of democracy.
Speaking with Jonathan Williams, Chief Economist and Executive Vice President of Policy at the American Legislative Exchange Council. We've been speaking with him about their 17th edition of Rich States, Poor States. But ALEC is also involved in a bunch of other policy issues as well. Jonathan, what is on ALEC's radar screen besides this Rich States, Poor States edition?
Well, in the next 2 hours, we're going to talk about all the other ALEC policy priorities. Now, we do have a ton that we're working on, Chris. And, some of the other big issues that we're working on are things like batting back against politically driven ESG, the so-called environmental social governance principles that are being used to really decimate American manufacturing and agriculture and energy across the board. A very dangerous time given the state of world affairs, unfortunately, that we live in, to be unilaterally disarming from energy independence. That's something that we're very concerned about. And we have been talking about ways to make sure that state pension funds and other funds should not be used to weaponize against American energy independence, American sovereignty. That's a huge issue for us. We continue to see success in that area. You talked a little bit a minute ago about education freedom. One of the biggest priorities that we're looking at is just how do we empower parents to make those key decisions for their children. Now we're up to 11 states, folks, after just being 3 years ago, basically having 0 states with universal education choice. We're up to 11 states. We fully expect more to move in the right direction. I know it's a big debate right now in Jeff City with some of our great ALEC members leading the charge on that effort. But so many other policies that we're working on, from deregulation to fighting back against this just horrible big government idea of a central bank digital currency that we're hearing more and more out of Washington, D.C. If we're concerned at all about our future individual liberty and privacy as American citizens, that ought to terrify all of us. So lots of good news out there, and also some really terrifying big battles that we at ALEC are in the midst of in educating legislators across the board.
Mm-hmm. Jonathan, we focused on a lot of the positives. Maybe we should give a parting message here of things not to do, right? And Jonathan, it's funny how, folks on the center right side of the political and philosophical spectrum, we talk about the failure of the big blue states and people say, oh, you're just being partisan. But Jonathan, it's numbers aren't partisan, right? Numbers don't get polarized. They just tell a story. And Jonathan, isn't it true that if you look at the bottom 5 to 10 states in the Rich States, Poor States 17th annual index, it's the states that, our listeners would expect to see. And maybe it will help open some of the eyes of the folks on the left-hand side of the aisle. But it's states like New York, California, which has the best weather in the land, Maine, Vermont, New Jersey, Connecticut. They're bringing up the rear in the caboose, Jonathan, and explain the big ticket items that drag them to the bottom of the ocean.
Well, it's all the above in terms of the big government wish list of some of the highest tax rates on businesses and individuals, high property taxes, high sales taxes in many of those states, not right to work states, high regulation, astronomically high minimum wage, as if government could wave a magic wand and actually make it that people would be better off through wages. I mean, it just doesn't work that way, clearly. And, the migration numbers, it's very hard to get away if you're a uncompetitive state to get away from that out-migration problem. And there have been, since just pre-pandemic, more than 15 million Americans moved from one state to another. So there's a huge amount of benefit for the states that get it right, a huge amount of downside for the states that get it wrong. And of course, California and New York both losing about 2 million on net over the last decade alone. And what does that mean? It means less economic opportunity for those that stay. It means less charitable contributions because those individuals that are leaving are actually not making their charitable contributions in California and New York anymore. And by the way, it means even for the big government ideological folks out there, it means less money to spend because all of those tax revenue dollars are now tax revenue dollars in some other state. And so no surprise, Gavin Newsom went from $100 billion surplus last year to something like a $75 billion deficit this year because of just the economic climate, and that out-migration is just one reason why.
Jonathan, there are economists on the left side of the spectrum who are actually making the case that the illegal immigration surge that we have seen has been good for the economy, that it has put workers into the economy, and it has actually helped shrink the deficit some to even lowering inflation. What do you say to those people that are currently making that argument?
Well, I mean, I'm just not seeing that. I'd love to hear them point to the data so far, and maybe that's anecdotally. I mean, obviously what we're all seeing in just these horrible headlines. I mean, being a Michigan native, just the killing there in Michigan and just the strain on public services. And you look at New York City and some of the images coming out of New York City and just so many of the issues that are revolved around this issue overall nationally. It's very concerning to look at, right? And there's folks, that I think are a big issue right now for ALEC members is, not respecting what Texas is trying to do to take care of its own state sovereignty as well, right? And the Biden administration doing nothing to absolutely stop the inflow of folks coming across the border, but except they want to go in and be involved and actually cut the wire that the Texas folks had put up to protect their citizens on the border. So, I mean, it's a very much an assault on state autonomy. It's something that I know as we talk with our Texas legislators or legislators from Arizona, New Mexico, or California that we work with, very concerning. But overall, I mean, I think we have to look ourselves in the mirror and say, are we going to be a nation of laws? We have a process to bring in folks that are seeking asylum and refugee status, certainly, and we need to be compassionate, but they need to go through the legal process to do that. And to become an American citizen, there's a long line of things that you need to do, including a citizenship test and many other things that we have in place for a reason. But by rewarding illegal behavior, exactly the wrong kind of message that we're sending to those individuals, maybe coming for the right reasons, maybe not. You hear a lot of bad stories about folks coming in, maybe for very bad reasons to the United States as well.
Jonathan, ALEC is a trade association, a national trade association for the legislators in the 50 states, but it's not a closed secret club, right? ALEC has a ton of information on its various websites, right? Any of our listeners, Jonathan, could go to either the ALEC or the Rich States, Poor States website today and look up and examine all the data that backs up every single assertion that we just made, right?
Well, absolutely. I mean, and we encourage people to do that. In fact, all of our different pieces of model policy that we put together at an organization over the years, probably 1,000 nearly now on ALEC.org, we have nothing to hide. It's the fact that we like our positions. We think they're the right positions, and we think most Americans probably do too. If you would spend some time at ALEC.org and see what we're working on, and moreover, tons of these studies that I think have really interesting applications as you're talking with policymakers or just concerned about the trajectory of Missouri or any other state that you're listening to today. We encourage people to check that out.
We have been speaking with Jonathan Williams, Chief Economist and Executive Vice President of Policy at the American Legislative Exchange Council. Jonathan, thank you so much for your time, sir, and we look forward to speaking with you again. Have a great weekend.
Great weekend, gentlemen. It's always great to join you.